I wake at 5 in the morning, before the light has acquired any warmth, before the neighborhood has remembered to breathe. My alarm is unnecessary. My body has long since calibrated itself to the peculiar rhythm of construction sites and sawdust of mornings that begin not with ease, but with a specific, deliberate intention. I pull on my oldest jeans, the ones with the paint-spattered knee and the fraying hem I keep meaning to retire, and I lace my boots over wool socks because the floors of half-renovated houses hold a particular cold that works its way directly into bone. I drink black coffee standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the blueprint spread across it like a second tablecloth. This is how my life begins, every single day. Brooke wakes at 10. She sends a text around 9:30, running a bit late. Love you, followed by a cascade of pink heart emojis. And by the time she arrives at whatever house we're transforming that week, the crew has already been at work for hours. She steps out of her car in white silk or dove gray cashmere, her hair arranged in that artful, supposedly effortless way that requires, and I know this for a fact, roughly 90 minutes of careful, methodical construction each morning. She smells of expensive perfume. She does not pick up a hammer. She does not examine the grain of the reclaimed oak. I spent 3 weeks sourcing from a salvage yard outside Portland. She cannot tell a load-bearing wall from a partition. She moves through the space I have designed, runs one perfectly lacquered fingertip along a surface I have sanded to silk, and then she turns to the camera with that luminous, practiced smile. "Can you believe this transformation?" she says. And the world without hesitation, without question, believes her. I am never in the frame. That arrangement was Colin's idea from the very beginning, and I accepted it the way you accept the terms of things when you love people too completely to interrogate them. Colin was dark-haired and persuasive, perpetually convinced he was the most strategically minded person in any room he entered. He had arrived in my life when the dream house was barely more than a local Instagram account, and an ambition I kept deliberately quiet, because ambition, in my experience, is most fragile when it's spoken aloud to the wrong audience. "You are brilliant, Audrey," he would tell me, and the word brilliant in his mouth felt like something sealed and precious being placed in my hands. But brilliance isn't always what sells. Brooke is magnetic. She's everything people imagine when they picture the life they want. He would take my face in his hands and look at me with an expression I interpreted, for an embarrassingly long time, as genuine devotion. "Stay behind the camera. Let her be the star. We will all get rich together." I believed him. I want to be completely honest about that. I chose to believe him, because the alternative, acknowledging the possibility that the two people I trusted most in the world were quietly building something I had no name for yet, was not something I could hold in my mind without it fracturing something essential. And so I stayed in the background, and I built. I drew blueprints at my kitchen table each evening, surrounded by cold coffee cups and stacks of architectural journals. I sourced the materials that gave our projects their particular distinctiveness. Antique brass fittings discovered at estate sales, original hardwood floors salvaged from demolished schoolhouses, plaster moldings commissioned from craftsmen whose trades were quietly disappearing from the world. I knocked down walls and rebuilt them stronger. I restored window frames warped by decades of weather and neglect. I learned plumbing from tutorials I watched at midnight and electrical wiring from a retired contractor named Gerald, who smelled of pipe tobacco and had the rare gift of teaching without condescension. The business grew the way genuinely good things grow steadily at first, and then all at once. Within 2 years, the dream house had become what the press enthusiastically described as a phenomenon, a social media empire built on the promise of beautiful spaces and seemingly effortless transformation. Brooke's face appeared everywhere: glossy magazine spreads, lucrative sponsored content, the kind of television pilot that networks fast track, because someone in a conference room watched the preliminary footage and simply said, "She's a star." Our follower count climbed into the millions. Brand partnerships arrived in avalanche. We signed contracts so large that my hand trembled the first time I held one. Through all of it, I remained invisible by design. Behind-the-scenes footage occasionally captured my hands, never my face, never my name in the accompanying caption, moving across a surface, threading cable, sketching measurements in pencil on raw wood. The comments sometimes read, "Who is that? She seems like the one actually doing the work." And Brooke would laugh during our evening phone calls and say, "God, people online are so relentlessly nosy," and I would laugh along with her because I had developed, without quite noticing I was doing it, the habit of treating my own erasure as a charming quirk of the business model, rather than the warning it was. Colin proposed during the renovation of a Victorian terrace in Connecticut. Kneeling on the raw subfloor, I'd spent a full day stripping, holding out a ring that was genuinely, achingly beautiful. I said yes, without a moment of hesitation. We were building something extraordinary, the three of us. A real team, each contributing what they did best, bound by blood and love and shared ambition. I was 31 years old. I had permanent dirt under my fingernails and architectural sketches on every available surface of my apartment and plans for a small farmhouse in Vermont, where I intended to build a quiet, deliberate life. My future felt, for the first time in my adult life, as solid and reliable as the structures I had learned to raise with my own hands. I had no idea that everything I'd built had already been quietly transferred, piece by piece, into someone else's name. I had no idea that love, in its most corrosive form, doesn't arrive with cruelty. It arrives as accommodation, as years of being told, gently and consistently, in a warm and perfectly reasonable voice, that the background is precisely where you belong. I believed it. I was wrong about nearly everything. The television contract arrived on a Thursday in March, a formal offer from a major network, the kind that comes in a bound folder, with brass fittings and carries the weight of genuine money, the sort that rearranges what is possible in a life. 7 figures, a primetime slot, a creative consultant budget that would have made the designers I'd apprenticed under in my early 20s inhale sharply. I sat at the conference table in the office I had converted from a defunct print shop 3 years earlier. I had stripped the floors myself, restored the original ceiling joists, rewired the lighting, and I read the contract twice, slowly and carefully, the way I approach blueprints, checking for load-bearing details that might be easy to miss. Something in me, some instrument I developed from years of working with structural materials, registered an almost imperceptible wrongness. But I set it aside. The numbers were extraordinary, and I had earned them. That evening, I told Colin and Brooke what I wanted. I had rehearsed it carefully in my head during the drive home, phrased it gently, without accusation, without any language that might read as a challenge to the arrangement we'd maintained. I was tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long workday, but something deeper and more systemic. The exhaustion of years spent operating below the threshold of visibility, of building things that bore someone else's name. I said that I would like to take my half of the contract money and the licensing revenue from the past 2 years, purchase the small farmhouse in Vermont. I'd been quietly planning around for months, and marry Colin. I said it warmly. I said it with every intention of it, sounding like a beginning rather than an ending. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of two people who have prepared for a conversation and are now deciding exactly which moment to begin it. Brooke set down her glass of wine with a deliberateness that I recognized, in retrospect, as a small performance. She crossed her arms. The expression on her face was something I had genuinely never seen directed at me by anyone, let alone by the person I had bathed when she was 4 years old and driven to the hospital when she broke her collarbone at 12. It was contempt clean, unambiguous, and completely unsoftened. "Your half?" she said, and her voice carried an incredulity so precise it must have been practiced. "Audrey, you don't have a half. You're a contractor. You've always been a contractor. If you actually read the papers you signed, rather than just trusting everyone around you, you would know that." Colin lifted a legal folder onto the table. He opened it to the first page and turned it to face me with the calm, deliberate efficiency of someone completing an administrative task. I am not going to recount every line of what I read in that document, because the specific legal architecture of what they had done to me is secondary to the simple, devastating fact of it. The trademark for the dream house, the associated bank accounts, the social media assets, the design patents I had filed under my own name and believed, with complete certainty, to be mine. All of it had been quietly, methodically, and entirely legally transferred to Brooke's sole ownership over the preceding 18 months. Every paper I had signed, and I had signed a great many, always in the middle of long workdays, always accompanied by Colin's easy assurance that it was just standard administrative restructuring, had moved me further from my own work without my comprehension. I looked at Colin. He was standing close to Brooke now. His hand moved to the small of her back with the ease of familiarity, not a gesture he had just decided upon in that moment, but one belonging to a pattern with its own long private history. "I'm in love with her," he said. Not apologetically, not with the decency of visible shame, simply as a statement of fact delivered in the even, mildly inconvenienced tone of someone correcting a minor misunderstanding. "I have been for about a year. I should have told you sooner, but we needed the business properly structured first." He paused. "The show needs Brooke. It doesn't need you, Audrey. It's never needed you on camera. A new creative team can handle the rest." There is something that happens in the body when the mind receives information it cannot immediately process. A specific, physical suspension, as though all systems have simultaneously attempted to reroute. My chest constricted. The room acquired a quality of unreality, objects maintaining their correct positions while losing their ordinary meanings. I looked at my sister. I looked at the man I had believed would stand beside me in Vermont while I planted a kitchen garden. I looked at the files. I looked at my own hands, which had done every single thing that had made this room, this company, this money, this entire life possible. They took my money. They took my name. They took my company and my future and 2 years of design patents I had built from nothing. I had been systematically erased from my own existence, and the two people holding the erasers were my blood and the man who had called me brilliant. Colin placed a single piece of paper on top of the open folder. A termination letter. My name in the recipient field. My own company's letterhead. I picked up my toolbox from the corner of the office where it had sat for 3 years. Scratched steel, covered in stickers from hardware suppliers, holding inside it the specific tools I had assembled and cared for over more than a decade. It was the only object in that room that was unambiguously, entirely mine. I walked out. I did not say a single word. I did not allow either of them the satisfaction of watching me fracture. But in the elevator, descending slowly through the building I had renovated with my own money and my own hands, something inside me, some structure I had not known I was depending on, gave way completely, and I pressed my back against the wall and held the toolbox against my chest like it was the last solid thing left in the world. Because in that moment, it was. The apartment I rented was on the 3rd floor of a building that had not been maintained with any particular conviction since approximately 1987. The radiator produced heat on its own erratic schedule. There was a crack in the bedroom ceiling that I traced with my eyes during the long nights when sleep became an abstract concept rather than something I could reliably access. I had enough in my personal checking account, money that had not yet been absorbed into the company accounts before the lockout, a modest emergency fund I'd maintained out of the unfashionable instinct of keeping something separate to cover 3 months of this bare, basic existence. After that, the arithmetic became genuinely frightening. I watched Brooke on television during those first weeks. I watched her on my laptop screen, sitting on the floor of my unfurnished apartment, eating cereal from the box because I hadn't yet been able to make myself organize a kitchen in a place that felt like a temporary stopover in a story I hadn't agreed to enter. The show had launched with the full momentum of the network contract, and the production quality was beautiful. They'd hired skilled designers and craftspeople and dressed the work in the aesthetic I had developed over years. Brooke moved through the spaces with her familiar, luminous ease. She was wonderful at the performance of it. That was the most disorienting part. She was genuinely wonderful. And performance, I began to understand in those weeks on the floor with my cracked ceiling, was what I had been underestimating as a category. Not because it doesn't require its own real skill, but because I had allowed myself to believe that genuine craft, genuine labor, genuine talent were their own sufficient protection against being replaced. I threw my phone out on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. I simply walked to the window and set it on the external sill and went back inside and closed the glass behind it. The silence was extraordinary. I cried. I want to note this plainly, without performing either fragility or strength around it, because it seems important not to edit the truth of that period into something more aesthetically resolved than it was. I cried in the way that only betrayal produces, not the clean, cathartic grief of ordinary loss, but something muddier and more corrosive, the specific misery of reviewing every memory you hold of a person and finding it has been retroactively altered into evidence of something you somehow failed to see. I thought of Brooke at 12, crying in the car with her broken collarbone. I thought of Colin's hands on my face saying brilliant. I thought about what it means to love people without sufficient skepticism. Then, on a rainy Wednesday in November, I went downstairs to take the garbage out, and I found a chair. It was sitting at the edge of the sidewalk in the rain, set out for collection, a Windsor-style dining chair, in what had clearly been, at some earlier point in its life, someone's good mahogany. One of the back spindles was missing. The seat had been painted over at least twice, unevenly, and the bottom layer, visible at the joints where the paint had chipped, was a beautiful, original walnut stain beneath the amateur white. The legs were still solid. The joinery was quality work, built by someone who understood wood as a material with its own structural logic. I carried it upstairs. I opened my toolbox. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil is not something I can describe in language that will reach you the way it reached me in that moment. It is not merely pleasant, it is, for me, something more specific and essential than pleasant. It is the smell of competence, of a self that exists independently of recognition, independently of anyone else's definition or permission. I began sanding the seat with 120 grit, then 220, working with the grain in the long, methodical strokes that feel, when performed correctly, less like labor and more like conversation. The wood came up gold beneath my hands. They had taken the money. They had taken the name. They had taken 2 years of my life, and the man I believed would build a quiet future beside me. But they had not taken the specific intelligence of my hands, the knowledge accumulated in muscle and bone over more than a decade, the irreducible fact of what I knew how to do. I went to a hardware store 3 days later to buy supplies, sandpaper, teak oil, replacement spindles I could turn down to match. It was a small, independent place, the kind that has existed in the same location for decades, and smells of raw lumber and iron filings, and something indefinably serious. The man behind the counter was quiet, probably mid-30s, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt, with what appeared to be genuine paint on the left cuff. He watched me examine a set of dowels with the patient attention of someone who understands that examining materials correctly takes a moment. He did not ask if I needed help. He waited. "Windsor chair," I said eventually, holding up the dowel I'd selected. "Replacement spindle," he said. Not a question. He understood immediately what I was doing and found this entirely unremarkable, which is the precisely correct response, and rarer than you'd imagine. His name was Mason. Over the following week, he offered me a part-time arrangement, restoring antique furniture in the workshop behind his store, pieces from estate sales and probate auctions, objects with original quality buried under decades of neglect or misguided modification. The pay was modest. I accepted without hesitation. It was Mason who suggested I record the work. Not my face, not a brand, not a persona, not the elaborate performance of accessibility that the platforms reward. Just my hands, the scarred, calloused, specific hands of someone who actually knows how to do something, moving through the process of taking a broken thing and making it whole. I created a page called The Honest Hands on a Thursday evening, using my old laptop and a secondhand phone I'd purchased for $40 from a pawn shop. The first video was 40 seconds. Both hands sanding the Windsor chair seat, the gold wood emerging from under the paint. No music, no narration, no caption beyond mahogany. 1960s. Water damage and bad taste, all fixable. By the following morning, it had 300,000 views. There is, apparently, a significant population of people profoundly fatigued by the glossy, performed version of making things, the television-ready transformation, with its convenient emotional beats and its immaculate hosts who never develop blisters. What they wanted, what the numbers made unmistakably clear they had been wanting for some time, was to watch someone who actually knew what they were doing simply do it without narration or manufacture. I gave them that. I gave them my hands and my materials and my process, and nothing else, and they responded with a loyalty that felt less like a following and more like recognition. Within a year, the income from the honest hands had returned me to financial stability. Within 18 months, it had made me genuinely, independently wealthy, the kind of wealthy that belongs to no one but you because you built every single piece of its foundation yourself. Mason made coffee in the workshop every morning and brought me a mug without asking how I took it, because he had observed this on the first day and remembered. When I cut my palm badly enough to need bandaging, he bandaged it without transforming the moment into an occasion for concern. He simply bandaged it, handed me back the chisel, and said nothing. He was the first person in several years who found my actual self, the real one, with the dust and the blueprints and the serious, particular knowledge, not merely adequate, but genuinely worth staying close to. I was building something entirely mine. This time, I knew exactly what I was building, and I knew exactly whose name was on the deed. 2 years moved through my life with a quality of steadiness I had not previously recognized as remarkable. Before, I had always been in some degree of acceleration, driven by the momentum of the business, by Colin's strategic urgency, by Brooke's endless appetite for more visibility, more growth, more of everything. Steadiness, I discovered in those years, has its own profound texture. I bought the farmhouse in Vermont in the spring of the second year, smaller than my original vision, more beautiful than I had imagined, with original wide plank floors throughout, and a stone foundation that a previous owner had maintained with genuine reverence. I drove up on a Saturday in April to take the keys and stood in the empty front room in my work boots, watching the afternoon light fall across old pine, and felt something I recognized, after a moment, as uncomplicated happiness. The honest hands had, by that point, surpassed the dream house's following by a factor of 4. I knew this, not because I was tracking it competitively. I had made a deliberate decision not to consume that particular content, but because people mentioned it in comments and in the letters that began arriving at the shop, telling me they had found my channel specifically because the contrast with what the dream house had become was so stark. Because without me doing the actual work, the quality had deteriorated in ways that the camera, eventually, could not conceal. The first lawsuits were filed 11 months after the show launched. A couple in Atlanta whose kitchen renovation had developed structural problems within 3 months of completion. A family in Phoenix whose custom cabinetry had been built with materials bearing no relationship to what they had contracted and paid for. The new creative team had the aesthetic vocabulary, but not the underlying competence. They could reproduce the surface appearance of what I had spent years developing without grasping the principles that made it functional and sound. The difference between a beautiful surface and a solid structure is not always immediately visible. Over time, it becomes unavoidable. Sponsors began withdrawing their partnerships in the carefully worded language of corporate communication, strategic realignment, evolving brand priorities, which is the polished way of saying that association with a liability has become untenable. The network delayed renewal discussions, then declined them entirely. The following began its slow but irreversible contraction as the algorithm, with its merciless indifference to narrative, redistributes attention toward whatever is generating genuine engagement, rather than merely sustaining an inherited audience. Colin, with the instinct of someone whose primary competence has always been identifying the most seaworthy vessel in any given moment, assessed the situation, and acted accordingly. He liquidated what remained of the accessible business accounts, transferred the funds to a personal account, and departed for where, exactly, nobody seemed certain. He left a voicemail for Brooke, from what I was told later, that lasted approximately 40 seconds and contained neither apology nor explanation, only the flat information that the business relationship was concluded and that he wished her well. She was left with the legal entity, the remaining debts, the pending litigation, and the specific public exposure of having been both the face of a failed enterprise and the person contractually responsible for every commitment that enterprise had made. I was at the farmhouse on an October afternoon, sitting on the front porch in the particular light that Vermont autumn produces, amber and horizontal, and absolutely precise when the car came up the drive. I did not recognize it immediately. It was not the car Brooke had driven when I last saw her. It was old, utilitarian, the kind of vehicle acquired when other options have been exhausted rather than selected. She stepped out, and I experienced a disorientation I want to describe accurately. She looked like my sister. Same face, same bone structure, but the presentation had been stripped of everything I had always associated with her. No immaculate styling. The clothes were expensive originals made shabby by stress and neglect. Her eyes, when she got close enough for me to read them, held something she had never let me see before. Not grief exactly, but the hollow aftermath of it, the specific desolation of someone who has discovered that the life they chose was built on foundations that were never genuinely theirs. She came up the porch steps, and then she was on her knees, and the theatrical quality of the gesture even now, even in genuine desperation, she was performing did not obscure the real distress underneath it. She was crying, actual tears, ugly in the way tears are, when they are no longer being managed for an audience. "Audrey," she said. "Audrey, please. You have to help me. Come back, you don't have to be on camera. I know you never wanted that. Just come back and do the work. Help me rebuild it. We can sort out the details. We are sisters." She said I owed her. She said blood was blood. She said she had made mistakes, and she was sorry, and she needed me to save her. Just this once. To come back in secret, to be the invisible engine one more time, while she reconstructed the public face of something we both knew I had built alone. I looked at her for a long moment. I want to tell you honestly what I felt, because I have thought about it carefully and believe the truth of it is more useful than the version that casts me as simply and cleanly victorious. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindicated in the satisfying, conclusive way that certain stories promise. What I felt, and this is the most accurate description I can offer, was free. The anger had burned through its own fuel long ago. In the tiny apartment with the cracked ceiling, in the weeks of dismantling what I had believed my life to be, and discovering what I actually was beneath it. What remained, looking at my sister on her knees on my porch, was something closer to clarity than any emotion I have a ready name for. I looked at her tears. They were real tears, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that they were tears shed for herself, for her losses, her debts, her ruined public image, and not a single one for the specific wrong she had done me, for the years I would never recover, for the name she had worn like a costume over work that was mine. She had not come to offer restitution. She had come to offer me the opportunity to be useful again. That was, and had always been, the full extent of what she thought I was worth. I stood up from my chair. "You didn't steal my life, Brooke," I said. My voice was quiet, not with uncertainty, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has arrived somewhere after a significant journey and knows exactly where she stands. "You stole a camera. The camera was never the point. I am the magic, and my magic is no longer available to you." She stared at me. She understood from my face, or from some instrument of her own, that there was nothing to negotiate. Not because I was being cruel, but because I was being precise. There was nothing left in me that she could reach. "Get off my property," I said. "Please." The please was genuine. It was not weakness. It was the simplest possible expression of the distance I intended to maintain between her life and mine. Complete, permanent, and accompanied by no residual hostility, because hostility requires ongoing investment in a person, and I had fully divested. She screamed at me then. She used the language of someone who has exhausted every strategy and fallen back on pure emotional volume. She accused me of coldness, of arrogance, of forgetting where I came from. She may have said other things. I am not entirely certain, because somewhere in the middle of it, Mason came through the front door, set 2 mugs of coffee on the porch railing, and stood beside me with the quiet, unceremonious solidity that was. She drove away down the road, too fast for the gravel, and the sound of the car diminished, and then disappeared entirely into the amber October afternoon. Mason handed me my coffee. He didn't ask. He didn't process or debrief or fill the silence with anything. He simply stood there in the Vermont light, paint on his forearm from the window frame we'd been repairing that morning, present in the way that some rare people are able to be present without agenda, without performance, without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it honestly was. I looked down at my hands, around the warm mug. The right palm still carries a scar from the chisel. The knuckles are roughened from years of wood and cold. There is, permanently, a faint line of stain beneath the thumbnail of my left hand that no amount of scrubbing fully removes. They are not the hands of the life Brooke had been selling the beautiful, effortless, immaculate dream. They are something more durable and more real than that dream ever was. They are the hands that built this house, that restored more than 400 pieces of broken furniture back to wholeness and beauty. That drew the blueprints for the light-filled workshop Mason and I finished in August, the one that faces east and catches the morning perfectly, that hold the coffee every day before the neighborhood has remembered to breathe. They are, without qualification or apology, the most beautiful things I own. They built my life the true one, the one with dirt in the grain and cold floors and coffee before dawn, and a man who knows what you need without being asked and stays anyway, in the ordinary and extraordinary way of someone who has chosen you completely. They built everything that cannot be trademarked or transferred or taken. No one is ever going to steal this from me again.